So good morning. I'm Gary Grotto. I'm the executive editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and this is the Morning Scoop. I want to thank you for joining me this morning to discuss the question of what do voters want? Do voters want an impenetrable wall at the border? Do they want their teachers well paid? Are their minds on our water supply? You'll find out in the next hour. But this next hour wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship of Center for the Future of Arizona. The Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that brings Arizonans together to create a strong and brighter future for our state by advancing the priorities Arizonans say matter most to them. CFA hopes that this morning's conversation will prompt the state's leaders, candidates running for elected office, and the media to counter political rhetoric and center the current priorities of Arizona voters in our midterm election. So how do we center the priorities of Arizonans in our elections to close known gaps between what Arizonans want and what we have? Well, today we will hear about new survey research of the priorities of Arizona voters. It was conducted by the Center for Future of Arizona and Education Forward Arizona in partnership with public opinion polling firm High Ground Public Affairs. We'll discuss the recent research, the views of Arizonans on education, economy, and more, and what changing the narrative of our politics and elections could mean for our state. At this point, allow me to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Sybil Francis. She's the co-founder and president and CEO of Center for Future of Arizona. She brings her passion for creating positive change, her love of Arizona, and her considerable prior national public policy experience to her leadership of the center. Prior to being named president and CEO in 2018, she served as executive director from 2002 to 2018, during which time she spearheaded key initiatives in education, workforce, and civic engagement and grew the organization's impact and programs. Good morning, Sybil.
Morning.
And also with us is Rich Nickel. He's the president and CEO of Education Forward Arizona, which champions P20 education attainment as critical to advancing the state's economy and improving the quality of life of its residents. Rich is a statewide leader in identifying and addressing practical and policy barriers to improving education along the entire education continuum, touting the importance of education and the return on investment that education provides to the Arizona economy, in addition to its benefits for students, their families, and their communities. Good morning, Rich.
Good morning.
And last, we have Paul Bentz. He's the Senior Vice President of Research and Strategy at High Ground. He specializes in public opinion surveys and is a three-time winner of Best Pollster by the Arizona Capital Times. He's got nearly 2 decades of experience in strategy, messaging, and campaign management. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And so I'd like to just start off with asking Dr. Francis to just share with us more about the Center for the Future of Arizona's work and a little bit about the Voters Agenda, the Arizona Voters Agenda Initiative.
Thank you so much, Gary. And it's so great to be with all of you this morning. Gary, Morning Scoop is such an awesome contribution to our community and to our understanding of important issues and brings really great panels together. So I just want to congratulate you. And also, I'm so pleased to be here with Paul and Rich. We've really had an interesting and fun time, in fact, developing this Arizona Voters Agenda. And it's so interesting. And I always love to be with the best pollsters, Paul. So congratulations on that. So I did want to talk a little bit about the Center for the Future of Arizona and what brought us to this Arizona Voters Agenda, because there was a trail of previous work and surveys. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 organization. I was one of the co-founders in 2002. And really our mission is to bring Arizonans together to create a stronger and brighter future for our state. And we focus very much on a positive agenda, one that what are the issues where we can come together and work together to create positive change. And so of course, naturally that makes us think of Arizonans and what Arizonans care about, because we don't have our own particular agenda per se, except to be representatives of Arizonans and trying to advance their interests. So one way that we do that really is to listen very closely to what matters to Arizonans, share trusted data about that information and how we are doing on those issues, and identify important issues. And then we also partner with communities and leaders across the state to advance that agenda. We partnered with the Gallup organization, the premier gold standard globally in public opinion surveys. I don't know if we need this up quite yet, this slide. I think it's a little premature. So we partnered with Gallup in the first time in 2009 and asked Arizonans what mattered to them. This is probably the largest survey ever conducted in Arizona, and was very comprehensive, representative of our entire state. We created a concept called the Arizona We Want, which is really based on the discovery at that time that Arizonans agree on much more than we disagree on the most important issues, which was kind of a surprise to us when we first did that survey. It was such a comprehensive survey, and we decided to repeat that 10 years later. So in August to October of 2020, and if you recall that time, height of the pandemic, prior to vaccines, really intense presidential election, racial reckoning. It was the hottest summer on record for Arizona. We surveyed Arizonans again and asked them about the most important issues to them at that time. And we certainly built on our original findings, but again, found that Arizonans agree on much more than we disagree. And in fact, we identified what we call 7 shared public values across education, jobs, the economy, the environment, and other areas, and 40 action items that we can move forward on. So that really sets the stage. But because this is an election year, we thought it would be really interesting, because we'd not done this before, to really sort of hone in on Arizona voters and find out what is it that Arizona voters care most about. Our previous survey was Arizonans writ large, whether they were voters or not. And this was really focusing on Arizona voters. Really interesting point, very consistent findings with Gallup. So whether or not they were voters or not, we do find a lot of consistency. But it was interesting to dig deeper into issues that we're hearing about every day. And I think one of the most important things to us, and one of the most important findings, was not only do Arizona voters agree on many of the big important issues, a lot of the things they care about are not being discussed by candidates. And we're also, so this is an effort to bring to the fore and center the voices of Arizonans in our public dialogue. We hear every day about partisanship and polarization and division. And so sometimes it's even really hard to believe that this is what we're finding, because you get one view from the media and candidates and what they're talking about, and then we actually listen to voters, and we're finding something very interesting and very different. So really, this effort of the Arizona Voters Agenda is an effort to center the voices of Arizonans in this very political year, help educate the media, because the media are very powerful, because they're the ones asking the questions. They're the ones setting the tone and the stage for what we're hearing every day. And then also help educate candidates. Are they really hitting on the right notes? Are they talking about the right things when it comes to what voters care about? And then finally, to sort of see, well, if there are these big gaps between what Arizona candidates and the media are talking about and what the Arizona voters care about, kind of asking questions, well, why is that? And how might we help advance the agenda? So I think I'm really looking forward. We're going to talk a little bit more about the details and the specifics of the survey, but I wanted to kind of set that stage. I also wanted to say that we're so pleased to work with Rich Nickel and Education Forward Arizona, because Center for the Future of Arizona really covered kind of the waterfront, if you will, of big issues. But we wanted to work with Education Forward Arizona because of their expertise and in-depth knowledge and prior surveying of Arizonans on education issues. And of course, we wanted to work with High Ground Public Affairs, because they are the premier Arizona survey firm, and have really have such great credibility and legitimacy in terms of how they conduct their surveys. So I think I'll leave those introductory remarks there, and then we can kind of go from here in digging in a little bit deeper.
Great, thank you, Dr. Francis. Rich, your organization did a survey as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of that and some of the background on it?
Sure, and just let me take 1 second for those who maybe don't know much about Education Forward Arizona. I think we're best known for being champions of P20 education and really attainment, because it's critical to our state's economy and just improving the quality of life of all Arizonans. And we also do that really under this lens of equity, because what we've heard across the state from all of our community leaders really is that every student in our state should have a fair shot at being successful in their K through 12 experience, and then being able to have great options to be able to access and enroll in our post-secondary institutions, really regardless of what type of training or education they're looking for afterwards. And just understanding that education really continues to be a key priority for Arizona voters. We conducted this additional survey in coordination with Civil and CFA, really just to gain a deeper understanding of voters' priorities when it comes to education, and really how we might compel our candidates to talk about and try to solve those issues that voters deeply care about, instead of some of these headline grabbers that we really see them tend towards as they're trying to get elected. And of course, we love working with Paul and his team also on the survey, and we also utilize them and partner with them during this process.
Great, thank you, Rich. So let's dig into the survey findings. Can we get that first slide up again, please?
Well, while we wait for that, why don't I give you a little bit of background on the survey and just talk a little bit about it. They mentioned that there is, in fact, 2 statewide surveys. Saw a question in the chat about 2020. In fact, both of these surveys were conducted in April. The Center for the Future of Arizona survey was conducted April 12th through the 19th. And then, the EFA follow-on survey was done the 10th through the 17th. Both are 500 samples. Both have a margin of error of 4.3. which means it could be in either direction by about 4 points. Now, that being said, one of the things that makes the Arizona agenda special is how we calculate what are priorities among voters. They are far above any sort of split issue. These are very much majority of large portions of the electorate finding support here. But here's the thing that I want to point out about both of these surveys. These are surveys of likely voters. These are the folks that are going to show up in 2022. We just finished 2020, which was the second highest voter turnout in state history. It was 79.9% voter turnout. In the midterm elections, turnout will be lower. When the president's not at the top of the ticket, turnout somewhere in the 60 to 65% range. The audience gets a little bit older, it gets a little bit more Republican in the state of Arizona. We took all of that into account so that we could say, no, these is what the folks that are going to vote in November care about, and these are the issues that are important to them. So all of this polling is aimed at that likely voter audience to give you a really good idea of what voters care about, what candidates should be talking about in November.
All right, well, Dr. Francis, can you share how the voters' agenda, the Arizona voters' agenda, identifies the top issues that voters are likely to vote in the general election?
Yeah, thank you. I did want to also respond to that question in the chat, because I know our center is affiliated with a number of major surveys, and I mentioned we did 2 massive Gallup surveys in 2009, then again in 2020. This is a new and different survey focused on likely voters that we partnered with High Ground with. So in terms of what made it onto the agenda, we had a very strict cutoff point. We said that 50% of likely voters had to agree with whatever the question was or whatever the statement was to make it onto the agenda. In many cases, we had way more than 50%, but 50% of all Arizona voters had to strongly agree with the issue. We also did a second check, or sort of second cutoff, which was that if you looked at the subgroups, the political parties and age groups, that those each individually had to at least strongly support at 50% or above to make it onto the agenda. So if any part of the agenda fell below 50% in responses, and we're going to talk about some really interesting ones that we hear a lot about, but that didn't make it onto the agenda because they didn't make these very, very well-defined cutoff points. So if something made it onto the agenda, that we had a very clear definition of what that meant. Is that what you wanted me to talk to, Gary?
Yeah. And Paul, let me see if I understand this correctly. So with the survey, what you could have is the 20-year-old progressive can agree with a 35-year-old independent and the 65-year-old conservative. Is that that what I'm hearing?
That's correct. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from all of this is that there are significant areas of agreement among the electorate that span across all partisan segments and all age segments. So that what we're talking about here is not one single group driving this issue, but it's got universal appeal. It appeals to larger swaths of the audience. It speaks to the broader coalition of individuals and understanding that. And while we talk about these issues that voters care about, I think there's one other thing that I want to point out is that there's significant pessimism in the electorate right now. Only about 43%, or pardon me, 35% of the electorate think the state is headed in the right direction compared to about 43% in the wrong direction. So that's one of the things that we're pointing to here is voters in general are not happy with the direction of the state, and it's been in flux, particularly post-COVID. And one of the reasons we believe that is because one of the candidates voters want to hear what issues are important to them and what things that they're going to do, not necessarily just the attacks over and over. And so what we found is that we found significant agreement in those areas that were up there, including education, immigration, the economy and taxation, and water and the environment, and election reform issues, and other categories.
Okay.
And I'll just jump in and just add that I think Paul alluded to this, but voters, first of all, we did an open-ended type of question saying, what are the top issues for you? And they were very consistent with the questions that we asked. And then it's also the case that, voters care more about where candidates stand on issues and their plans for addressing those issues, their solutions. If you add those two together, 2/3 of voters care more about the position on issues and has clear plans or position than their political ideology or party registration. And you can see that really overwhelmingly here. And I think when we look at these types of charts, they're hard to absorb because we are so being trained by the political and public narrative and media narrative that we are so polarized that it's almost hard to to look at a chart like this and say, wow, this is actually the reality, that we're much less polarized and divided. And it turns out, newsflash, that we're really, what we're hearing about in our political dialogue is really reflecting the interests of small minorities of voters in both parties.
Anything about this that surprised you, Paul, as a longtime pollster?
No, I think it speaks to the disconnect between what folks are talking about and what the voters want to hear about. About 2/3 of voters would really like to hear positions on the issues and talk about some big picture ideas and solutions to those issues. But what we get in the dialogue is much, shorter discussions, quick hit things, items that are, quite frankly, as a consultant myself, driven by consultants. The consultants have told them that this is the way to win. And so candidates are loath to go down this route and talk about these items. And that's one of the consistent themes that you'll see from all this is that I fundamentally believe that candidates could win talking about essential items and showing their plans and having real dialogue with voters instead of just these sound bites.
Rich, can you explain how, the education poll provides some additional insights on education priorities?
Yeah, thanks. I think we, tend to agree, and maybe we're somewhat surprised by how strongly folks wanted to hear about issues and the types of questions they would like for candidates to talk about and try to solve. And we also asked some really great open-ended questions. And we're really, I think, delighted to see really strong agreement among some really key issues that impact student outcomes. And, as you see here, people in Arizona like teachers a lot. I mean, this is a very strong polling result that says we need to continue to think about how we increase our teachers' salaries. But not just that, we also need to think about and really solve for this recruitment and retention issue that we have. I mean, you can just drive up the 17 and see billboards coming out of Texas that are openly trying to poach our teachers because they know that our teachers in Arizona aren't happy. And our voters showed extremely strong support for wanting to try to actually solve that issue. And on the other hand, as we've talked to candidates, they'll tell us outright that, their signs and commercials say one thing during these primaries that they know the majority of voters do not really want them to be talking about but they think it's going to give them the best shot in these primary elections, especially. And so it was just as interesting for us, not just what gained this support, which was really great to see all this agreement and these high aspirations about talking about teachers and talking about how we improve schools, how we offer more to schools that need it the most, how we help with math and reading, these really core fundamental issues, but also just totally showing almost, a lot of non-support for some of the issues we're seeing on the commercials every single day, like, banning critical race theory, things like, talking about gender during sex ed classes, talking about closing schools. Those were non-starters really on the education poll that we dug into.
And education has always been a high priority for voters, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this over and over. Education Forward and the companies that we are now with, have been doing this polling for at least 10 years. And every single year, education polls very high in general as one of the top issues, a lot of times being number one. And we think this year, this poll showed that, this aspiration gap that I think you referred to earlier between what voters really want when it comes to education, what they feel they're getting, is stronger than ever. And I think that's one of the things our candidates think about issues they really need to solve. It's that, how do they work with the voters to really close this aspiration gap of what the voters really want and what they consistently are getting, which they're, certainly not satisfied with.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's the aspiration gap and then there's the funding gap, because it's very clear that Arizona voters support more funding for K-12 education. They support increased teacher pay, increased funding for K-12. They think schools should have the resources they need. And one really great, interesting finding was that they also are very supportive of increasing education and training and CTE programs, but also education and training beyond high school and closing gaps in educational outcomes. So there's a strong recognition of the link between education and a strong economy as well. So understanding that we need more students going on to into post-secondary.
So to that point, Rich, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Sybil brings up two really great points, and then I'll hand it over to you, Paul, is that, not just the voters understand this connection between education and attainment and the economy, but as we've done the research, the economic impact research, things we've done in the past, things that have recently been done, it shows this massive, massive benefit from a better educated populace. And our voters know that. We did some research a couple of years ago that showed for every person that graduates from a university, you can think about that person really benefiting the state to a tune of about $660,000 over their lifetime. We also saw in that same piece, if we matched attainment to and skills to the workforce needs we're going to have, we're going to be able to put over $7 billion into our economy because our populace is so well educated. And so this connection between education, attainment, and the economy is clearly on the voters' minds, and people understand that intuitively and instinctively.
So we have a new slide up, and these are the top education issues, and I don't see any hot button issues. Now we'll get to the hot button issues later in this discussion, but Dr. Francis, can you talk a little bit about this, these priorities here?
I'd be happy to. These were the results of the Education Forward survey. So I, might suggest that that Rich speak to them specifically. But I think to your point about, hot button issues, this is in some ways what we're trying to communicate is a problem relative to Arizona voters, because Arizona voters care about the things on the screen. They care about the other things in the Arizona voters agenda, which I know we're going to get to. But they're not hearing about the plans that the candidates have on these for the most part. I just did want to respond quickly to one of the questions I saw in the chat, which is, yes, you can access the results of these surveys on our website at arizonafuture.org. and on the Education Forward website. So we have shared this information, and you can go to our websites to find it. But Rich, do you want to, I see, Paul, you're also been trying to jump in. I'm not trying to manage the conversation here, but
I think, all I'll say is, we've discussed some of these, but it's clear that the voters, think, and these are important issues. They aren't the headline grabbers. And, we also see that voters know that, if we're going to give every student a fair shot at success and to enroll and gain access to some post-secondary training or education, that also we need to think about how we incentivize our students from low-income backgrounds to really access that more. And really, that's the only shot we have at meeting our attainment goals, is by getting every student involved in this education or training after high school to be a more highly skilled workforce. Paul, sorry about that.
No, I just adding some fine points. More than 2/3 of the electorate believe that schools are underfunded, and even more, nearly 3/4 believe that teachers are underpaid. These are the top issues facing the state because voters want to hear the candidates' plans. Obviously, we all would like to make sure every school has a quality teacher and principal, but the challenge here and the questions that we want to ask is, what's your plan for that? All of these are priorities for the voters and for large majorities of them. And to put a fine point on one of them that Rich alluded to earlier, look at career and technical education. 97% of the electorate supported career and technical education, including 97% of Republicans. What are a lot of Republicans talking about right now? Critical race theory. Only 67% of Republicans care about critical race theory. And so they're leaving, 20+% of their own party on the sideline when they talk about that issue instead of something like career and technical education, which is much more well-regarded, much more desired, and has all the economic impacts that Rich talked about. And that's where we see this big disconnect here, is that's where they're getting their feedback from the primary audiences, from these maybe these small precinct committee meetings they go to. They would be much better served to talk about their plans to increase teacher pay, support quality education, math and reading, and career and technical than they would be to be talking about these very narrow audience items.
Paul, when it comes to CTE, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Paul speaks so eloquently about this. I was just going to say, Paul speaks so eloquently about this gap, because I did see a question in the chat about primary electorate, likely voters versus general. But I think, Paul, you're making a really interesting point that even in the primary, candidates could be addressing these issues. It's not just waiting for the general election to address them.
It's really hard to pivot too. I mean, a couple of these items that we'll talk later about that didn't make the agenda, really a large swath of independent unaffiliated voters don't support them. So if you're going to make, for example, they don't support banning critical race theory. They don't think that's a top priority. Doesn't mean they support critical race theory. It just means they don't require banning critical race theory, other controversial topics being taught in the classroom. Same thing Rich talked about with gender issues. These candidates that focus on that might be doing it to their own detriment, because they're going to have a very difficult time transitioning back to the general electorate and talking to those audiences as well.
And when it comes to the CTE, Paul, it seems like it's something that has sort of swelled up in the last few years, at least by, what I've seen. And I mean, does the data back that up? Are people more interested in the, technical education?
Absolutely. Workforce training, making sure we have people for companies to hire. It's become much more clear to the electorate that if we want to attract good businesses, high wage jobs, we have to offer a quality education, not only for them to have a workforce to hire, but want them to bring their executives and their families to this state to receive an education as well. And, one of the things that we did see in this last session is that the legislature put $1 billion into education, or almost $1 billion into education. And Chris Cotterman from ASBA said it's not a risky proposition. And he's right. The majority of the electorate believes that these schools are underfunded, want more money into education. And so that's one of the things we see when they focus on those issues. It's not a risky proposition for them to do so.
All right, let's move on to tax, or the economy, inflation, and taxes. The legislature, historically likes to cut taxes. Paul and Dr. Francis, can you discuss the voters' views on taxes? And can we get slide number 8 up?
I'll jump in and then let Paul elaborate because he's so knee deep in this all the time. But I thought this was some of our most interesting findings, excuse me. We often hear candidates, and, for years, I feel like I've been hearing about, cutting taxes. But what was interesting was cutting taxes just did not rise as a priority for Arizonans. They believe that our tax structure is fair and that everyone should pay their fair share. No one's signing up for more taxes, but they're certainly not a driving force in terms of how they see the issues facing Arizona. And what was interesting is when we asked them specifically, relative to the surplus, would you rather, I'm so sorry, I don't know what's going on with my voice. They much preferred investing the surplus in education, infrastructure, water, and other issues than cutting taxes. So even put against those investments, they preferred those investments to others. They also support increasing resources for schools, and that schools need the resources that they need to run the school. And I think we already talked about that relative to education. So Paul, if you wanted to elaborate on any of the tax issues.
I think you hit the big ones there. One of the just big takeaways that we saw is that while the legislature was not making a risky maneuver, investing additional money in education, there is not a significant appetite among the majority of the electorate to continue to cut taxes. Instead, what they'd rather do, especially since we have an ongoing surplus, is see that invested in critical infrastructure items, including education, public safety, roads, and other items. 82% of the voters support that as a notion, including 70% of Republicans. This is one of the things that we continue to see, is that there is this disconnect where there was several legislators and others that were loath to spend any of the surplus. But what we really see is that voters understand these investments and want them.
All right, well, let's move on to the budget. Dr. Francis, is your voice better? Did you want to discuss the budget a little bit?
Yeah, I'm good.
I think Rich can talk about it too.
I think
Rich
we did with infrastructure, but go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Let me jump in for just a second, Gary, on this budget, and I'll deal mostly with the education side here. We were happy to see a significant investment in K-12 in the budget this year. We think that there was great opportunity, and some of that opportunity was utilized. We do think there was some missed opportunity though, because frankly, when it comes to things in the early childhood and really going through the post-secondary piece of that, we didn't see the investments that we could have seen based on this surplus that we had. I think also, when it comes to the budget, although we got, some things like the opportunity weight, which is terrific, where we're going to give more resources to schools who serve students that are from low-income backgrounds. We thought about students this year who have learning disabilities or other disabilities, how we can provide more supports to assist those students, some really important things like that. But, one of the pieces that happened out of that budget was, it was built on this agreement really that we would expand universal vouchers. And so I know it's a controversial subject, but, we don't think that the expansion of those vouchers, even in trade-off for this, what is a lot of people are really patting themselves on the back for in this budget, is great long-term policy. And so we think there was some really great stuff done in this budget, but maybe you don't like necessarily how it came from. And the voters, though, if you look back to the poll, what it clearly says is they agree that we should be spending money on teachers like we did by raising the base. We should be spending money on helping schools do better, which we did by, this opportunity weight, helping schools that serve, students with disabilities, things of that nature. So I think what the voters said in the poll and some of those K-12 moves that were made in the budget do align.
Do you think the voters would be satisfied with the budget, the education budget that came out this year, knowing what you know from your polling?
I won't guess what the voters would be satisfied with,
Mhm.
I think that there's parts of that budget that they will see that align on the investment with what they're interested in, especially when it comes to some of the teachers. But I also think that there's pieces that they really want to see that aren't in there, especially when it comes to how we help students who are from lower income backgrounds gain better access to post-secondary training and education. That really wasn't addressed this time, things of that nature. So I think it's probably a mixed bag on that. And that's also how we've kind of talked about the budget as we've gone back and really looked at what happened.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to water. We just allocated $1.2 billion for, to manage water, for a water supply. It's becoming, it's a hot topic issue, and it's becoming an issue that I would say the general news consumer, average news consumer is aware of now. Why aren't the candidates talking about it, Paul?
Why? So number one, Gary, you're 100% correct. Water is up significantly in the last few years as an issue. On other statewide polling, we've seen it is as high as number 3. We did an open-ended question in CFA about what if the top issues are, and water was up there as one of the major issues that we saw in all of that. Part of the reason that they don't talk about water issues is, quite frankly, because it's hard. Candidates get a lugubrious face when they have to talk about water because it's difficult. But voters want to hear about it. Voters want to know what the candidates' plans are on this. And this is one of the ones that has a big disconnect. Again, just like we saw with education, the legislature saw that there's an issue and took action. It's quite frankly not a risky issue to take on that issue because voters care so much about it. But it's a complicated issue. It's complex. It's got a lot of ins and outs. There aren't as many experts regarding water as there have been in the past. And like I said, for the most part, when you look at policies that these candidates are pushing or what's written on their website, usually the consultants have written those. And quite frankly, the fact of the matter is consultants don't know enough about water to put together a comprehensive plan. And that's where the media and business organizations and other people have to come in and ask tough questions about water and not accept platitudes about desalinization or anything else, but rather have a comprehensive plan and encourage these folks to think about it. The only way we get better solutions on water is if we push for answers on it.
So, Sybil, what are the voters saying about water from your survey?
Well, just to build on what Paul said, this is a very high priority. And just as a reminder, I did see some questions in the chat about numbers and what are the numbers and everything. Just a reminder, anything that made it on the agenda had at least 50% strong support among likely voters. And in many cases, like water, much higher than that. So we're not throwing all these numbers at you because it gets a little head spinning. You can find that on our website at arizonafuture.org. But needless to say, just to reiterate what Paul said, voters are very concerned about water. They want to hear about the plans that candidates have. They want to hear how the candidates are going to secure our water future and address our long-term drought. The voters are not experts on water, but the candidates need to become experts on water in order to answer these questions.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what didn't make the agenda. Dr. Francis, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We already did discuss the critical race theory and banning books and discussions of gender that did not make the agenda. These were not high priority items in the way that we have defined them for the Arizona voters agenda. Cutting taxes, as we already mentioned, also did not make it onto the agenda. That's not a high priority issue for likely voters. Oh, so one of the areas that we did ask about were elections. So there were several findings about the elections. One is there is no widespread view that there was fraud in the election or that the election was stolen. Relative to election practices and processes, there is no appetite for banning mail-in voting. Voters like their mail-in ballots, thank you very much, and they want to keep voting accessible and easy. Now, is that to say that they don't think, possibly there could be some tweaks? No one's saying the system's completely perfect, but I think there's very clear evidence that Arizona voters want to keep their mail-in ballots available to them. Building the wall, I think we already mentioned, did not make it in our definition. It's not supported by 50% or more of Arizona voters. And I think those were the main ones that we wanted to highlight. We didn't get a chance to talk about immigration, but we had huge support, in the 80s and 90s across all parties, of course, for immigration reform, and same numbers for supporting a pathway to citizenship, including for Dreamers. So there is huge interest among Arizona voters in immigration reform. The statements that they support on immigration are that they want to see a functioning border for commerce. They'd like to see immigration reform, and but building the wall did not make it onto the agenda. Well, did I leave anything out?
I think you hit the big ones. I just, a couple things to note on some of these. That is not to say some segments, and I think we'll talk a little bit about the disconnect between the primary and the general in a minute here. But certainly some of the segments, certainly Republicans supported building the wall much more than everyone else. But it's one of the things that you have to bear in mind as we look through all of this is the agenda is about where there's support among a majority of all partisan segments and all age segments. What we're seeing in these cases is things like building the wall, items like the banning of critical race theory, banning early voting does not meet those standards. And in fact, the idea and notion of getting rid of mail-in voting is incredibly unpopular among the electorate. I know there's certain segments that have concerns about it right now, but the general notion, that is not a popular notion among the electorate. And ultimately, what we're talking about is about 24 to 25% of the electorate in the general election will be independent voters. Independent voters aren't treated fairly in the primaries. They can request a partisan ballot, but they have to go through a lot of rigmarole to do that. That's why they underperform. They're somewhere in the 10 to 15% of the primary participation right now. But what we do see is in the general, they're going to play a major role. And so one of the issues we just talked about, water, independents care deeply about water, pardon the pun, and they want voters to talk about that. They care about education. They want to protect their right to vote. They might think the elections need to be more secure. But the ultimate issue is all of these candidates, and Sybil alluded to it earlier, Rich alluded to it too, that these candidates know the issues they're talking about now are not the ones for the general election. But that's creating a challenge for some of these folks when they definitely go down the election fraud route or one of those items. It's going to be really difficult for them to navigate back among unaffiliated voters and get them to support them because they're not with them on the litany of items. And so that's the challenge that all these folks are going to face. And there is an alternative. And I see this a little bit in the chat. Well, yeah, that's this is the primary and you're talking about the general election. Candidates have run general elections a certain way for a long time because that's the way they're run and that's the way they're told to run them. But you can win a primary and a general talking about these issues without having to really wildly shift your narrative back and forth, change your complete website, change all your bullet points between the primary and the general. This demonstrates that. It absolutely is possible for a candidate to do that.
Now, that's for, like a competitive district, but so many of our districts aren't competitive. You don't have to make that turn for the general. I mean, is that part of the problem?
Well, let me jump in here because I think we talked in the beginning and about the gap between what Arizonans want, what Arizona voters say is important to them, and what we hear political candidates talking about, and dare I say, what we are getting out of our political leadership. So I think that there are some issues there. And to me, what we have two objectives as the Center for the Future of Arizona. One is we're trying to build a positive agenda where we can bring Arizonans together on things we agree on and do something. I think people are getting very tired of and frustrated by all this partisanship and gridlock in many ways, both at state and national level. So we're trying to say, hey, there's some bright spots here that we can build on. We're not naive. We also know that elections sometimes, because of the way they're structured, may have be incentivized candidates in a certain way. So why is it, I've seen a number of these questions in the chat. I hear this question all the time. Well, if this is what Arizonans want, why do we keep electing these people? Well, part of it is because of the nature of the way our elections, especially primaries, are run. So Paul said, independents have to jump through extra hoops to run for office. They have to collect 7 times more signatures than Democrats or Republicans. And if you are an independent voter, you may not realize this when you declare your independence from your party and go be an independent voter. It's much harder to vote in the primaries if you're an independent voter, because the parties don't want you. If you don't show allegiance to the party, they don't want independents to easily vote in the party elections. And so you have to request a ballot. And so that extra step means that independents vote at lower numbers. I know Paul has those numbers off the top of his head. So this is one of the challenges, because roughly speaking, about a third, Democrat, Republican, and independent in Arizona. So that's one reason that we may not be seeing coming out of elections, especially because the primary often is the determinant in terms of who gets to run in the general. So if you have more partisan people voting in primaries, then you're going to have more partisan people who may not be representative of the electorate overall getting to the general, and then there may not be choices.
So Dr. Francis, you talk about changing the narrative. How do we do that?
Well, by doing this, for starters, this is what our passion and commitment is, which is let's bring the voices of Arizonans to the fore. The media are dominating, the candidates are dominating. We hear that we're polarized, that we're divided. Sure, we don't all agree on everything. But if we actually focus and think about the things where we agree, including this really stunning results of this likely voters of Arizona, there is so much area. There are so many areas where we could be coming together, but we're not hearing about that. And our system may not be structured to help bring that out. So we are trying to, first of all, communicate to our fellow Arizonans and leaders and others who we are as Arizonans. Let's hold a mirror up to ourselves. Then let's ask the question, if this is who Arizonans are, how do we actually actualize that? How do we make sure that Arizona views and preferences are expressed through our politics? And there are different ways to do that. I think by educating the candidates, and we're working on that, by educating the legislators, we're working on that, by educating the media, because as I said in my opening remarks, the media is very powerful in terms of setting the stage. If they're only focusing on the minority, small, percentage of what voters care about, we're going to all think that that's how everybody thinks. But what we found out from this survey is that's actually not true. So I think education is our first objective. And then perhaps through education and greater knowledge, we can find ways to address these issues. I think the primary system, districting is probably a very important issue as well. Like you said, Gary, if there is safe, quote unquote, districts, that also affects outcomes. So I think sharing and education are really a first step from our perspective. And frankly, creating hope. I get very emotional responses sometimes from people who are just so grateful to hear that they're not in a minority, that in fact, the things that they feel are things that their fellow Arizonans also feel and believe, and that they're not alone. I think it's so easy to feel like this crazy world out there that's so polarized and divided. And then you realize maybe there's people out there who agree with me and that we can, there's some hope for positive change.
Paul, how would you advise candidates with, using this data and trying to win an election?
Well, one thing, before we leave the changing the narrative, I think Rich should talk a little bit about some of the education narrative and how candidates are talking about it versus the way they could talk about it. And then I'll give some advice after that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that what we're seeing is candidates, sometimes even know they're talking about kind of non-starter voter issues. But, being a team player means a lot in politics, and they acknowledge that, and especially when it comes to fundraising. And also we hear from media that covering these really deep issues isn't as easy and doesn't sell as many papers or ads as covering some of these really sexy kind of headline grabbers. So I think we have to acknowledge that, but we also have to be willing to dig in and ask the hard questions and demand that those questions get answered by our candidates. And, business and community leaders, many of who I've seen putting questions in today and that I know are watching, really have a unique opportunity, I think, to engage the candidates to help change this narrative and really get away from or counter some of this divisive narrative we're hearing. And so, one thing we've done is develop this robust set of questions, really based on what we heard from this poll, that are ready for, folks here that are watching today, business and community leaders really around the state to use as they're addressing some of these candidates, and ask them to, how are you going to solve this issue? And really put those candidates, on the spot for understanding these issues, being able to talk about them, and really giving thoughtful policy answers. I mean, the main thing that we've taken away from this whole experience is that voters want people to prioritize policy over politics. And, we think that's a really hard thing for candidates to do, and we understand that. But we do have some of these resources on our website to help people ask those hard questions.
And to the point, to Rich's point, I think one of the things that we're looking at, for example, we tested both investing in underperforming schools and closing failing schools.
Right.
And we saw a significant amount of support for investing in underperforming schools and not as much support for closing failing schools. So sometimes the shorthand, easy, throwaway answers aren't the right answers that voters are looking for. And I think that the questions that they've posed, the questions that CFA posed, getting those in debates, having the reporters ask the questions, putting those in your candidate questionnaires for your business organization, those asking more fine-tuned questions that demand responses, not just canned answers, I think can go a long way to doing, greater work. And for the candidates, I advise them to actually take the time to answer those questions. That's not traditionally what a consultant tells these candidates to do. They get another questionnaire in, they forward it off to somebody, and somebody else fills in the answers and sends it back in. But taking the time to better understand the questions that are being asked and talk to broader portions of the electorate. We've seen people be very successful on the statewide basis. Yeah, our redistricting system, only 5 of our legislative districts are competitive. The other 15 either benefit Republicans or Democrats. Those 5 races will determine the control of the legislature. But all of these statewide candidates need to win statewide. And so they would be wise to especially pay attention to those independents, because those independents in 2018, the 195,000 voters that voted for Doug Ducey and Kirsten Sinema, and the same similar number that went across the aisle and elected Mark Kelly, and also in lesser degree Joe Biden, those are the folks making the decision on these statewide audiences. You can't ignore them or in your primaries from both sides of the aisle, quite frankly, and then expect to come back and win them.
Paul, thanks so much and Rich for mentioning the questions. On our website, we actually extracted some questions that could be used based on this data to ask candidates running for office. And to further add to my answer earlier about how do we get this information out there, we are working with organizations that are sponsoring candidate forums to help provide this data, but also suggest questions that they might ask that is based on the data. I know we just have a few minutes left, and Gary, I was kind of looking at some of the questions and wanted to comment on a couple of them. One of them asked about, did protection or destruction of Arizona's environment make the agenda? And we didn't get a chance to talk about environment, but consistent with our Gallup survey, this high ground survey also showed very high interest among Arizonans in protecting our water, natural areas, and wildlife, and to really have sustainable practices that create a good quality of life for all Arizonans. So there's very strong support among Arizonans for all of this in the environment.
Well, there was one question, actually 2 questions that had to do with healthcare that I wanted to touch on real quick, and you know, like you said, we're running out of time here, but why do you believe healthcare access, cost, quality, et cetera, didn't resonate as a topic? And someone else asked, which is probably the second part of the question, does this mean we've solved, quote unquote, solved healthcare in Arizona? Are you surprised it didn't make the list?
I'm going to let Paul jump in on that one because he's done a lot of that particular polling in the past.
Sure. So we asked voters an open-ended question: what do you say is the top issue facing the state? And healthcare was 67 total responses of healthcare compared to 180 responses for immigration, 143 for the economy, 133 for education, 123 for environment. Those who focus on the health aspect of it are very passionate about it. But what this really measures is top issue. What are the top of mind? What are the things that are unsolved? So I would not go as far as to say that voters believe that healthcare was solved in the state, but it has lowered down the priority list a little bit because there are bigger, broader, you know, dare I say, nagging issues that they would like to see addressed more immediately. Education was the top issue and has battled with immigration for a long time. Part of that has to do with media coverage. Those are the top two issues that are most covered and most talked about. So that drives the narrative on both of those topics. We don't see as much healthcare coverage these days when it comes to media. And so that's probably why it's down the list a little bit.
In our Gallup survey, we found that only 60% of Arizonans are satisfied with the quality of their health care. So that leaves some millions of Arizonans who are not satisfied. So by no means has this issue been resolved. And certainly for those folks who do not feel they're getting quality health care, it's obviously a very important issue.
All right, so we got about 3 minutes left, 4 minutes left. Can we just go around the horn and just talk about what's next? What can be done next here?
Well, I'm excited because we've talked to Paul about doing a quick follow-up survey after the primary is over to kind of check back in, especially because certain things have happened since we initially put the survey out, including some commitment of the surplus to various expenditures. So we want to find out, we want to follow up, how are voters feeling about that? So we're going to be following up and we'll be releasing those findings, and we're committed to continuing to bring the voices of Arizonans and Arizona voters to the general public, to leaders, to the media, to elected leaders and candidates for office.
So I think you'll see Education Forward Arizona really focused on continuing just to elevate these issues and continuing to encourage the candidates through the primary, then into the general, to talk about these priority issues. And you won't just see that here in Maricopa, you'll see that around the state. We are a statewide organization. We have support and folks who are dedicated to rural Arizona, and we're certainly talking to those rural leaders also about this. So, you know, we're excited to move forward. We need to continue to really inform action around this. And we hope that everybody will call on candidates to really prioritize these issues and encourage voters to vote.
20% of the Republican primary audience is still undecided in the governor's race. 40% of them are undecided in the Senate race. 60% of them are undecided in the Attorney General's race and the down ballot races. There is still a lot of voters who have not made up their mind on these topics and still haven't decided candidates. We'll expect a very similar number going into the general election as well. So what we're going to continue to do is talk about the issues where there's significant amounts of agreement and explore some of the topics that maybe have changed to get an understanding of where the electorate is at going forward. I think, you know, first of all, thank you to everyone for being here today and taking the time to listen to this discussion. If we had just read the survey instruments to you, it would have almost taken up the entire time of the process of the depth and breadth that we went into these surveys. So I encourage you definitely to go to both of the websites. They've got tremendous assets that you can look at that have the questions, the priorities on both the education side from EFA, as well as some of the other topics from the Center for the Future of Arizona. And really you can dig in and look into all of these topics and see where the numbers are and see for yourself that there is a large amount of agreement among the electorate on a significant portion of these topics.
One last question. So what would state government and the legislature look like if candidates followed the Arizona voters agenda?
They would be working together to support and advance the interests that you see in this survey. There would be less gridlock, there'd be less partisanship, we would be less focused on, issues that only appeal to a minority of the electorate. I don't want to describe it politically particularly, because I'm not sure what that word would be, but they would be representative of Arizonans, and we'd be getting a lot more done.
All right, well, we've come up to an hour, and I want to thank our panel, Dr. Sybil Francis of the Center for Future of Arizona, and Rich Nickel of Education Forward Arizona,
Thanks,
and
Gary.
Paul Bentz of High Ground. And I want to thank our sponsor, the Center for the Future of Arizona, and thank our viewers for tuning in. And we'll be back next Wednesday with another morning scoop on the lingering effects of COVID on education. And I'm Gary Grotto with the Arizona Capital Times. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Gary.
Great to be with you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.